Yes. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and good night for some people. This time, as we have our speaker from all the way Australia, and it's already after midnight over there. So we will try to make it as short as possible, only 30 minutes of presentation, inshallah, and then 30 minutes of discussion. In 1 hour, we'll try to finish. And our presenter for today is Brother Turhan Yolcu from University of Melbourne. He is an ABD, namely a candidate to receive, as soon as he finishes his dissertation, his PhD degree at the University of Melbourne School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. His doctoral thesis at the moment is on the issue of philosophical skepticism, and particularly the relation between external world skepticism and a priori skepticism. So this is another topic in the Risale, also quite, discussed also. He has contributed a chapter to our forthcoming volume on Bediuzzaman Said Nursi's perspectives on creation. Hopefully soon it will be published also. In addition to the thought and writings of Nursi, his research interests include epistemology, philosophy of religion, and the philosophy of science, and particularly the problem of induction. And he is married and he has 2 sons. So I am very much pleased today to present Turhan Yolcu to talk on inference to the best explanation, a key mode of inference in Nursi's Âyet'ül Kübra, that small risale. That will be a good discussion, inshallah. Yes, please, Turhan Hocam, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Hocam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's tuned in. It is a very great honor for me to be in the company of such experienced and valuable scholars. So I do very much appreciate the invitation. Without any further ado, I'll get into my presentation. As Hojam mentioned, I do unfortunately need to keep it a little bit shorter than what you guys are probably used to. I do need to get up for work, unfortunately, in a few hours. So I'll try to whiz through this as quickly as I can. What I'm going to talk about is based, at least in part, on the chapter that Alparslan Hoja mentioned. So we do have a forthcoming volume, inshallah, on Bediuzzaman's views on creation. And I did, in my chapter, in my contribution to that volume, I did speak about the inefficacy of finite causes in Bediuzzaman's Âyet'ül Kübra in particular. So my talk tonight is going to be based roughly on that. I'm also going to add certain things that I didn't have room to include there. So first thing that I want to say is that, of course, I'm going to make the argument that in Âyet'ül Kübra, a key mode of inference is, in fact, inference to the best explanation. So I'm going to make that argument, but in doing so, in no way do I intend to in no way do I mean for anything that I say to stand in opposition to the very good presentation that was done just a few weeks ago by Mustafa Turhan, Hocam. He did make the argument there that Qiyas al-Temsili is a foundational kind of inference in the Risale-i Nur. He described it in terms of deductive syllogism. So what I'm going to say tonight does not mean to stand in opposition to that. I do agree that that mode of inference does play a very important, indeed a foundational role in the Risale-i Nur. But I just want to say that I don't think that necessarily that's the only kind of inference that Bediuzzaman has recourse to. I want to say that he, I'll try to make the argument that he makes additional sorts of arguments, also deductive in nature. Okay, so what I'm going to do is present inference to the best explanation as a kind of deductive inference in its own right, which might itself be somewhat of a controversial view. However, I want to argue that Bediuzzaman does appear to take a deductive view of inference to the best explanation himself. So without further ado, let me get straight into this. First thing that I want to say is that in propounding arguments for Allah's existence and unity in the Risale-i Nur generally, Bediuzzaman wants to take the Quranic highway, okay, what he refers to as the Quranic highway, in preference to the arguments of the scholastic theologians. So he says, for example, in the 33rd word, it is more certain and easier to demonstrate a stamp particular to the creator of all things on everything than causes being cut at the extremities of the world with the proofs refuting causality. Through the effulgence of the Quran, all the windows and all the words are based on this principle. Okay, so he's telling us clearly there that he wants to follow the Quranic style. Okay, which, as he points out here, as he points out elsewhere in the Risale-i Nur, is to have recourse to the kinds of proofs that are accessible to the broadest audience. Okay. He says in the 32nd word, for example, he says, every creature, every particle, every star is an illuminating argument for the necessarily existent and absolutely powerful one. Every link in the chains of beings in the universe is a clear evidence for his unity. The all-wise Quran proves this with its innumerable proofs. Okay, so proofs as in plural there. So the Quran presents us with different kinds of proofs, but it mentions most frequently those proofs that are clearest in the view of people generally. Okay, and then he provides an example. Okay, he says, for example, and then he quotes from the Quran, and it's rendered here in English as follows. If you ask them, who is it that created the heavens and the earth, they will certainly say Allah. Okay. So he presents that Quranic verse as an example of one of these kinds of proofs that are clearest in the view of people generally. Okay. So I want to say that Bediuzzaman, wants to emulate this particular style. He too wants to provide those sorts of proofs. And I say that he does this frequently in Âyet'ül Kübra, okay, all throughout Âyet'ül Kübra and many other parts of the Risale-i Nur as well. But what kind of an argument is that one that I just provided the English rendition of its meaning for? Okay, so again, if you ask them, who is it that created the heavens and the earth, they will certainly say Allah. Okay, what does Bediuzzaman say about that particular argument, or the arguments that is couched within that verse? He says, again in the 32nd word, because of the way the heavens and earth have been created, anyone who is conscious and intelligent will be compelled to affirm the glorious creator. As the Quran says, they will certainly say Allah. Okay. So what kind of an inference is that? I think the simplest answer is to say that, at least in the first instance, it is an inference to the best explanation. Okay. What's being argued there is that, given the properties that they manifest, the heavens and earth compel us to affirm Allah as the explanation or cause, as opposed to other alleged causes, such as nature or physical forces or laws. Okay, so you might be thinking at this point, why think that that sort of an argument is in fact an inference to the best explanation? Okay, isn't it just a case that we're seeing phenomena in the universe and we're just affirming Allah as their cause? Why is that an inference to the best explanation? Someone might ask. Okay, well, I hope that once we disambiguate what is meant by inference to the best explanation, it'll be clearer to see why that is so, why that kind of a verse does in fact couch an inference of that sort. Because, I guess the issue is that inference to the best explanation is often confused, with the sort of abductive reasoning, for example, that Charles Peirce wrote about, some decades ago. The problem is that, however, what's meant by inference to the best explanation in the modern, philosophical or epistemological discourse is actually something somewhat different. It's at least somewhat different to what Charles Peirce was referring to. In the modern understanding, inference to the best explanation is really just that sort of inference that we rely on all the time. It's quite ubiquitous form of inference, and we rely upon all the time whenever we're seeking to know the explanation for something. Okay, so for example, I hear 3 knocks. Okay, just like those that we just heard. I hear 3 knocks coming from my door, and I wonder what could be the explanation, like what could be the cause of those knocks, perhaps, right? Now, if I was to wonder in that way, if I was to think in that way, and I after thinking about it for even just a moment, I was to then affirm that, oh, look, there's probably somebody at the door. Well, I would just be drawing an inference to the best explanation out of perhaps a number of competing explanations, a number of possible explanations. I'm inferring that one of them is a better explanation than the others. Okay, I'm affirming that one of a number of explanations, perhaps each of which is capable of explaining the phenomenon in question, that one of those is better than the others, and that therefore it is the correct explanation. It is the right explanation. So that is the kind of inference that is just completely ubiquitous in our cognitive lives. Both philosophers and psychologists agree that just like deduction and just like various kinds of inductive reasoning, we utilize this all of the time. So it's this everyday sense of inference to the best explanation that philosophers and epistemologists are referring to when they talk about IBE, or inference to the best explanation. Just inferring what is the best explanation for a given phenomenon. Okay. Now, it's utilized in circumstances like this. So in addition to being used in everyday reasoning, it's used all the time, especially in science, in medicine, in law, in numerous contexts, many contexts. And in every case, we utilize it when there's some surprising fact. Okay, so epistemologists will describe IB in these ways. There's some surprising fact, they'll say. So what does it mean to say that there's some surprising fact? It's just to say that there's some fact that is contingent. Okay, it's contingent in the sense that it didn't need to exist, right? So consider, for example, a particle of light, like a photon of light. Okay, we see a photon of light whiz by. All right. This photon of light didn't need to exist. It could have just as easily failed to exist. Indeed, there was probably a time when it didn't exist. Wind back the clock a few billion years, 14.5 billion years, and probably that photon of light didn't exist, right? So clearly it doesn't have to exist. So then the question arises, why does it exist? And indeed, it has certain properties. It manifests a certain order, let's say. It travels at a certain speed, some 300,000 meters per second, let's say. Now, it could have traveled at some other speed. There isn't anything in logic to say that it has to travel at that particular speed. So therefore, the question becomes, why does it travel at that speed? So to that extent, both the existence and the properties of the photon of light are contingent things, right? They're contingent, they're surprising facts. Therefore, they need an explanation. They're not like, let's say, for example, the proposition like this, the proposition, the sum of 1 and 1 is 2, okay? 1 plus 1 is 2. If anyone was to ask, well, why is it that 1 and 1 comes to 2? We would say, well, look, that doesn't require an explanation in the same sense as the photon, right? It's just a necessary fact. I mean, it's just logically or mathematically necessary that when you add 1 and 1, you get 2. It cannot be otherwise, and that's the key thing when it comes to phenomena in the universe, right? Physical phenomena. Gluons and muons and photons, composite objects, right? Stars and planets, the fact that those planets orbit those stars, for example, and all kinds of phenomena, any phenomenon that you can point to. In every single case, those phenomena didn't need to be that way. They didn't need to exist, and they didn't need to exist in the way that they do. In other words, they didn't need to manifest the properties they do. So whenever we notice that a fact is surprising in that particular sense, right? So we're talking about contingent facts here, contingent beings here. It's under those circumstances that in seeking to know the cause of that thing, in seeking to know the explanation of that thing, what we're actually doing there in reasoning about that thing is that we're drawing an inference to the best explanation. So I've said here on my PowerPoint, which I'll actually neglected to send this through to Hakan Hoja, but I'll do so at the end, inshallah. But in my PowerPoint here, I've just said, to draw an IBE, an inference to the best explanation, in circumstances where there's some surprising fact, it's just to think about what best explains this fact that requires explanation, and to then affirm that that best explanation is the right explanation. Okay. And that's exactly what's going on in that example that I referred to in the Quran, okay, that Bediuzzaman referred to. It's to consider the heavens and the earth, notice that they require explanation due to their existence and the properties that they manifest, and to then see that positing Allah as the explanation is what will best account for them. Okay. Now, you might wonder at this point, well, hang on, what about the situation where we don't give any credence to any alternative explanations? There are a number of Quranic verses like that, and I'll give some examples shortly, momentarily, but there are numerous examples of at least implicit reasoning in the Quran, which I'm going to say are all inference to the best explanations, where it looks like all that's going on is that a particular explanation is being affirmed as the right explanation, but no credence at all is being given to any alternatives. Okay, what about in situations like that? Is that still an inference to the best explanation? So, circumstances where we're sure that there's, for example, only one possible explanation, which is, again, an example that we'll see in, for example, the Tabiat Salis, Bediuzzaman's treatise on nature. In circumstances like that, where we allege that there's only one particular or one possible explanation for some phenomenon, and we don't give any credence to other possible explanations. Well, in circumstances like that, again, philosophers agree. The standard view nowadays is just that, well, that's still an inference to the best explanation. Why? Why is that so? It's because to completely discount or ignore other explanations is in every case to imply that those explanations that we're discounting or ignoring are inferior. Okay, so at least implicitly we're saying that they are inferior to the explanation that we are in fact affirming, okay, which is to say that that particular explanation is best. All right, so it doesn't matter if we're talking about only one possible explanation for a phenomenon, or whether or not there are numerous candidate explanations. In both cases, we're still drawing inferences to the best explanation. We're reasoning about what can explain something, And sometimes in doing so, we're just completely throwing out other explanations. There are always inferences to the best explanation, right? That's the general understanding, okay? That's the dominant understanding. So once we understand inference to the best explanation along those particular lines, in other words, once we disambiguate what we mean by inference to the best explanation, when we disambiguate it from maybe the sorts of abductive reasoning that Charles Peirce referred to in his earlier writings, we then see many, many examples of it in the Quran, in Âyet'ül Kübra, and indeed many parts of the Risale-i Nur. Okay, so let me just read some quick examples here. I think I've already used up a lot of my time. So yeah, I'll just whiz through just a few examples. These are all going to be rendered in English, okay? And have you seen that seed which you sow? Is it you who makes it grow, or are we the grower? Okay. And another verse. And have you seen the water that you drink? Is it you who brought it down from the skies, or is it we who bring it down? And have you seen the fire that you ignite? Is it you who produced its tree, or are we the producer? Or were they created by nothing, or were they the creators of themselves? And now an example from Âyet'ül Kübra. Okay, he says at one point in Âyet'ül Kübra, these hundreds of thousands of wise, merciful and ingenious tasks and acts of generosity and mercy that arise from the veil and outer form of this inanimate, lifeless, unconscious, volatile, unstable, stormy, unsettled and inconstant air clearly establish that this diligent wind, this tireless servant, never acts of itself, but rather in accordance with the orders of a most powerful and knowing, a most wise and generous commander. Okay, right. So there he spoke about the wind. Later he talks about, again in Âyet'ül Kübra, plants and animal life. Okay, he says the plant and animal life can in no way be attributed to chance, to blind force, or to inanimate nature. Okay, and there are many, many other examples like that. Okay, so in all of those examples, we're seeing that a particular explanation of phenomena is being affirmed as being the right explanation, which, as I said earlier, is to, in every case, at the very least, implicitly, and sometimes even explicitly, as we just saw from the example in Âyet'ül Kübra, whether implicitly or explicitly, it is to set aside other possible explanations and to uphold or affirm a particular explanation as being the best. Okay. Now, a counter argument that might come to mind at this point, right, is that this inference to the best explanation that I'm asserting is the mode of inference that Bediuzzaman's using in many parts of the Risale, indeed that we see in numerous Quranic verses. Isn't it problematic that this inference to the best explanation has generally been considered a non-deductive form of reasoning? Okay, so isn't inference to the best explanation and abduction more generally just a sort of inductive inference, to the extent that, it's a non-deductive form of inference? Isn't it just something inductive and to that extent uncertain? Like, isn't that problematic? And why that might be problematic is because, again, as Mustafa Hojam pointed out in his presentation a few weeks ago, Bediuzzaman does certainly want to assert that the arguments that he provides us with a very firm degree, of certainty. He'll say in certain parts of the Risale-i Nur that, the matters that he's proving, he's proving them, with the same certainty, as twice 2 equals 4, and so on. Okay, so he does insist that, we're getting a very high degree of certainty from these arguments. Isn't that problematic in the case of, my argument tonight? insofar as inference to the best explanation is not deductive, then it can't have the same degree of epistemic certainty as a deductive argument. Well, the problem is that not everybody agrees that inference to the best explanation is in fact an inductive mode of inference. Okay, and it's not only Muslim scholars that are asserting this. It's not merely theologians or anyone of that nature. Even secular philosophers of science, modern epistemologists hold this view. For example, my own supervisor, Howard Sankey, a well-regarded philosopher of science, he is very open to the view that inference to the best explanation is, in fact, a kind of deductive inference. And in taking this view, he cites another well-known philosopher, Alan Musgrave. So you've got all these guys that are saying that, well, actually, no, what inference to the best explanation is actually a deductive enthymeme, right? So what's a deductive enthymeme? It's just a deductive argument with a hidden or implicit premise, okay? So let me make this explicit, okay? So, here's an example adapted from Alan Musgrave's influential article. He has an article, The Ultimate Argument for Scientific Realism, okay? In there, he describes inference to the best explanation in these terms, okay? He sets out its form roughly in this way, okay? So premise one, explanation E is a satisfactory or adequate explanation of surprising fact F. Okay. Premise two, out of all known competing explanations, none explains F as well as E. Now, if no known competing hypothesis explains F as well as E, then explanation E is the best satisfactory explanation of F. Okay. Therefore, it follows that E is the best satisfactory explanation of F. Now, here's his implied premise, right? So remember, we're saying that inference to the best explanation is a deductive argument with just a hidden premise. Yeah? And once we make this hidden premise explicit, we see that hopefully the argument is going to be deductively valid. Okay. If something is the best if something is the best satisfactory explanation of a fact, then it is rational to take it to be defeasibly true. Okay. So from all of that, it follows that it is therefore rational to take E to be defeasibly true. Okay. What do we mean by defeasibly true in that argument? It just means true in the absence of a defeater. Okay. So again, what's being argued, okay, by a number of philosophers is that, when we do draw these inferences to the best explanation, we don't really mean to, we don't really take them to be arguments whose conclusion is sort of merely probable, like, a standard sort of inductive argument. Really, what we take them to be is a kind of deductive argument with an implicit premise, that premise being an epistemological principle, okay? An epistemological principle to say that it's actually rational to take the best explanation, right? The best satisfactory explanation, not the best bad explanation, but the best satisfactory or adequate explanation of a fact, that it's rational to take that to be defeasibly true. It's true until or unless, some new evidence comes to light to, make us think that, no, that's actually wrong about that. And if that doesn't happen, then, yeah, we can happily go on taking that explanation to be true. Okay. So that's how they think inference to the best explanation should be understood. And if that's the case, then it is indeed a deductive mode of inference, in which case it can afford the same kind of epistemic certainty as other kinds of deductive arguments. But I want to say that Bediuzzaman seems to take a similar view, but a somewhat stronger view, okay? Which is to say that the kind of inference to the best explanation that I believe that he is presenting, whether in somewhere like Âyet'ül Kübra or indeed in Âyet'ül Kübra, is one that's in which we can be even more certain, than the sort of argument that someone like Alan Musgrave would, the sort of argument form that someone like Alan Musgrave would propound. So I'll provide an example here from Âyet'ül Kübra. Okay, he says at one point, right, where it seems quite explicit here, right? Quite explicitly, he seems to be utilizing an inference to the best explanation. He says, "You are bound to say either that the causes in the world create beings, for example, this animal. That is to say, it comes into existence through the coming together of causes, or that it forms itself, or that its coming into existence is a requirement and necessary effect of nature, or that it is created through the power of one all-powerful and all-glorious." Okay. He goes on, "Since reason can find no way," right, and by way there he means a candidate explanation, of course. "Since reason can find no way apart from these four, if the first three are definitely proved to be impossible, invalid and absurd, the way of Tawheed, the way of divine unity, which is the fourth way, will necessarily and self-evidently and without doubt or suspicion be proved true." Okay. So he's telling us there, if reason tells us there are only four possible or candidate explanations of the beings in the world, right? All the surprising beings, all the contingent beings in the world. And three of these candidate explanations fail. This means that the fourth explanation has to be true. Okay. So he doesn't leave any room there for brute contingent facts, okay? In other words, he doesn't believe that there can be any contingent beings that just lack an explanation, okay? So what he seems to be doing there is he seems to be putting forward a truth or a law, a principle, if you will, as follows, that every contingent being must have some explanation, some external explanation, right? It can't explain itself. It's got to have some explanation beyond itself, okay? Now, this is probably something that he takes us to know a priori. It's, just an epistemological principle that we just can access through the operation, say, of the ana, through the operation of the aql and the qalb. We just know this to be true in maybe quite a fitri way. And since that's the case, since these contingent beings, they can't lack an explanation, his premise in Âyet'ül Kübra seems to be that since beings cannot be without explanation, if all candidate explanations apart from one fail, then the remaining one must be true. Okay, so we see that there's a difference between Bediuzzaman's view, or rather, there's a difference between the sorts of inferences to the best explanation that Bediuzzaman's drawing and the sort that Alan Musgrave refers to in his article. Bediuzzaman's ones are of a stronger form, okay? Because Musgrave's allowing that an explanation, right, if it's the best explanation, right, if it's the best good explanation, that it can be seen as defeasibly true, right? True in the absence of a defeater. Whereas what Bediuzzaman is saying, right, is that an explanation has to be true, okay? It must be true if it is the only good explanation, all right? So therefore, he's not concerned with the possibility of encountering any defeater. Okay, so whereas Musgrave allows room for possible defeaters, the kinds of IBE that Bediuzzaman's propounding, they're the sort that leave no room for a defeater. Okay. His certainty that no new evidence or new explanations will ever come to light, right? I.e. that what human reason sees exhausts all the possibilities, right? Seems to accord, I believe, right, with how we reason in other contexts. Okay, so I've said that Bediuzzaman, unlike Musgrave, doesn't leave room for other explanations, right? So in circumstances where reason tells us that, look, there are only 4 possible explanations. Now, 3 of them seem completely no good. 3 of them seem completely inadequate to explain, the contingent phenomena, that we're confronted with. Therefore, the 4th must be correct, right? That's Bediuzzaman's principle. That's what he builds his, inference to the best explanation on. That is the, key premise in his IBE arguments. Now, can he get away with that? Is that's the question. Because what if somebody says this? Well, why have so much confidence in human reason to be able to exhaust all the possibilities? We're only finite beings with finite capacities. I mean, might it not be the case that even though our reason can only see these 4 possible explanations, might there not be some 5th explanation that we just haven't thought of, that is perhaps beyond our intellectual capacities? Can it not be the case that there are these additional potentially at least there might be these additional explanations? Bediuzzaman seems to close the door to that. Why does he get away with that? Well, I would say in response to something like that, if somebody was to allege that, what I would say is that in reasoning in that particular way, really we'd be reasoning in quite an exceptional way. Which is to say that we don't really reason in that way at all in any other context, right? So to reason in that way in the present context would be just quite ad hoc. Right? Consider this particular example. All right, if I was allowed to reason in that particular way, if I was allowed to say, epistemically speaking, right, if it was fine for me to say, look, there might be some 5th explanation that our reason cannot even see, then it ought to similarly be okay for me to reason like this, let's say in a legal context. Okay, imagine I'm a defendant in legal proceedings. The police have arrested me for the commission of a crime. Now, they've arrested me for, let's say, the theft of a particular jewel. Now, let's say my fingerprints are on the jewel. Let's say there's video evidence of my stealing the jewel. Let's say there are a number of witnesses all pointing to me having stolen it. Let's say that subsequent to my arrest, I even provided a confession to the police about it. So all the evidence is pointing to me. I'm the only good explanation for the theft of that jewel, let us say. Can I argue in this way in court? Can I say, oh, well, Your Honour, look, although all the evidence points to me, although there does not appear to be any other explanation for the theft of that jewel apart from my having stolen it, there might be some second explanation that we can't even think of. Therefore, you should find me not guilty. Could we argue in that way? I mean, probably rather than send me to jail, they might send me to the mental asylum if I was to argue in that way. We just simply don't argue. We don't get away with reasoning in that way in other contexts. So why should we be able to reason in that particular way, when we want to avoid some theological truth, right? In the context of, an argument of the kind that Bediuzzaman's propounding, why should we get away with, if reason can only see 4 possible explanations, 3 of which are completely rubbish, why should I be able to allege that maybe there's some 5th explanation? So given all of that, it seems that, Bediuzzaman is quite justified in that particular principle that he, that additional premise that he provides. Again, that premise, it's just that, look, if there are only, X number of candidate explanations for something, there are only 4 explanations, 3 of them are no good, then the 4th has to be right. That particular epistemological principle, it seems that Bediuzzaman's quite justified in. So there's a lot more that could be said, much more that could be said, but I think I've already gone well in excess of my 30 minutes, so I apologize for that. I'm got a little bit carried away. My apologies for that. I'm going to hand it over now to you guys. I would welcome your comments and suggestions. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much. It was a very good discussion. There is already one question sent to me by Mustafa Hoca from the US. He has a class, but as far as I say, he's still here. Would you like to ask your question before you leave? He has a class at 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Very thought-provoking. And I also want to, mention that as far as I understand, Turhan is maintaining a podcast on the, Risale-i Nur. So people may want to take a look at that. Maybe you can send a link or something about it.
I will do. Thanks for mentioning that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. So it's thought-provoking, and I need to look into the matter myself further. I didn't know the Alan Musgrave's position on this. I'll take a look at that, inshallah. But in the meanwhile, I was also thinking, perhaps could we think of this as the more familiar concept of sabr wa taqsim in the usul, in the methodology of Islamic jurisprudence, even before the introduction of Aristotelian logic into the tradition, or as disjunctive syllogism in the Aristotelian logical tradition. The difference, if we do that, the difference would be that we a priori admit the existence of a certain limited number of possibilities, and then instead of trying to infer to the most likely among those possibilities, we would be eliminating all but one, which would then amount to complete induction, which also is the equivalent of deduction in terms of the certainty that it gives. It's just another way of thinking about it that I think you may want to give a thought.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate your comment. You're absolutely right that we can, of course, formulate the the same argument in those sorts of in that sort of deductive form. But I think what you will find is that look, any argument can be formulated any way that we want. Like if we put in the right premises, we can turn any inductive argument even into a deductive argument. We can do whatever we like. But in the present context, if you were to formulate the argument in that particular way, still you would need to justify the premises. Okay, so it's in the justification of the premises then that you would still need to engage in the same kind of explanatory reasoning, right? Again, you'd need to draw an inference to the best explanation in your thinking about how to justify the premises. Right. So sure, we can express an argument in a particular way, but what I'm interested to know is that not so much, not only how is the argument expressed, but what is the thinking that supports it? Like, what is the justificatory, process that's going on, beneath the surface, right? So I think that beneath the surface, in every case, yeah, what we're going to see is an inference to the best explanation. That's my view.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more hands raised up, but I have one comment type of a question, if you allow me to ask, because I'm just wondering if is inference or deductive argument is the only way or best explanation. There is something that came to my mind, in the early Islamic tradition, we have a form of explanation that is called tafsir in the literal sense. Later on, it acquired a technical sense also, but I am more referring to this first sense, tafsir, because at the beginning, the Prophet ﷺ, he was alive. As a result, he would give the explanation, and he was the authority. Nobody would argue against him, and they would have accepted. So therefore, they would not develop arguments. Later on, of course, there was no such centralized authority, and gradually, what we call today, tafsir in the form of philosophical argumentation, and the best one that is known is Fakhruddin Razi's tafsir, of course, in this sense, and there are many others that came out, and then ta'wil gradually developed also. So I want your comments with regard to this. What would you say?
Yeah. Okay. So what comes to mind? Just again, even in circumstances, like as I said during my presentation, like even in circumstances where we don't give any credence to other possible explanations at all, right? So like, in those Quranic verses, for example, where we're being told, it is Allah who creates this or Allah who does that. Even in circumstances like that, I still think that they can be viewed as inferences to the best explanation, insofar as when we infer that something explains something, right? So what we're doing there straight away is we're differentiating this from, say, perceptual knowledge, okay? Like, I mean, I wasn't there to see that photon get created, right? I didn't see, Hasha, I didn't see Allah create it. So I don't know it perceptually. So I've always got to infer its explanation, right? I've always got to infer its explanation. Now, let's say that I have it on, the Prophet ﷺ's authority that there is no explanation for that other than Allah. Still, what I'm doing is inferring that Allah is the best explanation, okay? Because to say that, to affirm a particular cause as being something's explanation, is always at least to implicitly reject all other explanations, right? So it's due to the fact that we're at least implicitly rejecting other explanations that we're still selecting the best explanation, okay? So yeah, I think that it can, still be understood in that way, inshallah.
Yeah. Okay, Nejat Hoca, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Turhan Hocam. First of all, in regard to your interpretation of the 4 options discussed in the Tabiat Risalesi and the nature, I always thought that Nursi is not actually building his argument based on claiming the limited number of available explanation, and then once you've proved that the 3 of them are not adequate or not consistent, therefore cannot provide explanation, that the 4th one must be. I feel, there are such statements like this there, but he is actually, the way I read it, he's kind of providing existing explanation and say, look, those existing one does not provide really adequate, simple, sufficient, consistent explanation. But then he will say the 4th one, irrelevant of those 3, does provide those. So in the sense that his 4th option is even if you take out all those 3, you can still rely on the 4th one irrelevant of the first 3. So it's not like saying, okay, it's like when you're choosing this multiple choice question, you basically show 3 options are wrong and therefore the 4th one must be correct. He's not going in that way, in my understanding. He still goes deep into his own argument to show the sufficiency, the consistency, and the simplicity as well. He will use this one to basically show why his explanation is the best. That's one thing that my understanding. The second thing is that I know what you think about. The second thing is that so I'm just curious what you think and how you relate Ana into this. Take Ana into the picture, because it seems like when you say inference is the best explanation. And then can we say is because that you're relating to the Ana? And in this case, if you relate to Ana, can you make this an inductive argument? Because now you already have Ana, and through the Ana that you have certain knowledge, And then now that can you rely on this kind of use this as a referential, and then based on what you observing, the data you have, that you can make an inductive argument, and in this case to know through and that was and in this regard I think that it will be very interesting to look at the intuition as a concept in phenomenology. That when their argument is that you can intuitively know something through the self, and that intuitive knowledge in their argument does not require any other additional argument or evidence, because you're directly exposed to the creation, you're directly exposed to the phenomena. So I think that's one of the very key differences I understand between phenomenologists and, let's say, Kantian kind of views of that you cannot really access, you cannot have access to the noumena, you can only see the appearance or the phenomena. That's one. The third one is that I'm just curious about what you think in terms of, again, hermeneutics. So the idea here is that if if we are looking everything in terms of meaning first and foremost, so, and in this case, can we say an inference on meaning is an unavoidable anyway, and then everything in a way is interpretation. So, and in this regard, that's how would you put this into your whole argument and relate?
Okay, I'll maybe pick one of those three questions to try to answer in my limited time. I appreciate those comments. There's certainly some thought-provoking material there. But how I think the NA plays its role in all of this is again, going to relate to the justification of the premises of the argument. Okay, so so in the first instance, what I think is going on is that there's an inference to the best explanation insofar as we're saying, look, these three explanations are not good, but this one here is good. So that is, prima facie how the argument seems to run. But then there are always going to be questions as to why is it that we think, for example, that explanation 1 is no good, and 2 and 3 is no good, and why do we think indeed 4 is good? So it's going to be at this point that we introduce all other kinds of reasoning, and we avail ourselves of all of the resources at our disposal to answer those questions, to justify our view. So actually, I found Mustafa Hoja's presentation from a few weeks ago really beneficial in respect of this particular issue, because he did talk about the role that the NA plays in his presentation too, and I wholeheartely agree with his comments. I do think that the NA is going to play its role there. Qiyas temsili he spoke about, that's certainly going to play a role in justifying why we don't like those other explanations. And if you consider, for example, Tabiat Risalesi, though he starts off by saying that, explanations 1, 2, and 3 are no good and only 4 is good, when he wants to explain to us why, for example, 1 is no good, then he goes into all kinds of analogies, all kinds of, qiyas temsili to say why they're no good. And it's at that point that, the NA plays its role. If you recall, Mustafa Hoja did speak about, a kind of deductive syllogism that those qiyas temsili amount to. Now, how is it that we know the premises of that particular deductive syllogism? Well, some of them, the NA just knows through its own, experience. Okay, so like I know this, for example, right? Like first of all, I know in a very much a priori way that lifeless, unconscious, inanimate beings, they cannot produce orderly structures, right? So, if I was to bring my little boy down with his, bag of Lego bricks, Right? If he was to pour them out in front of me now, really no order is going to come of those bricks, right? We're not going to see an aeroplane or, you know, or something that in the shape of a planet or anything of that nature, just through the Lego bricks themselves or through the introduction of wind or you know, other unconscious, unintelligent, you know, lifeless beings. No, you know, we really do need a being, you know, a cause with life and will and knowledge to really account for that. So you know, we know this, I say, a priori, but then what happens is that universal truth, okay, that general truth, we see examples of it all the time. You know, we see it instantiated all the time in particular situations. You know, for example, I see in my own life that, you know, if I don't put pen to paper, no thesis is going to be written. That thesis just simply is not going to write itself. So what happens there is that, you know, my own lived experiences in the world, they very much confirm to me. They act as a confirmation. You know, I see and the instantiation of that general principle, right? That you know, that general rule of law. So I think the NF plays an extremely important role in the justification of the premises of our argument in that sort of a way. Yeah. And I must say I'm greatly indebted to Mustafa Hoca for his presentation. Like, I've listened to it, at least parts of it, several times over. Yeah, really, really beneficial. So I think you should consult him for a better answer than what I can provide.
Ibrahim Hoca, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you very much, Turhan, for this presentation, because he said the author, the Said Nursi himself, says this is a difficult text to understand, because I have written down my own observation according to my own understanding and for myself. But when we reflect on this, and he also says it is not in the tradition of the Kalam tradition. So I think we also have to say something about his as introspective approach, an introspective approach to understand the text, and also experiential, existential. The Nejati just mentioned a little bit in connection with Ana, but here I think we have to the whole approach is somehow it is different, a totally different new you know, let me say hermeneutic or experiential tafsir of his interaction in his daily life. Would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, you know, he does reserve a very, very important role, you know, for experience, you know, because ultimately, I believe what the Risale-i Nur is ultimately concerned with is that, you know, Bediuzzaman is, you know, deeply concerned that we gain a knowledge of Allah that's not merely of the intellectual kind. You know, he wants to bring about us a transformative change. Like, you know, he doesn't merely want me to see, for example, that, hey, order doesn't come about without an orderer, you know, therefore the order in the world, you know, must point to, you know, Allah as its cause. No, he wants me to come to, you know, he's encouraging us, like, you know, as the Quran does, he's encouraging us to, you know, come to know that all the relevant, you know, names and attributes of Allah, you know, through the very experiences that we live. So to do that, to really know what it means for, you know, Allah to be, you know, an orderer, you know, or to have power, or to have compassion, or to have generosity, what you indeed need to do is actually engage in those sorts of behaviors yourself. Okay, it's not enough merely to have an intellectual knowledge of the giving of charity, right? No, what needs to happen is that you need to, under difficult circumstances, right, where, you know, the nafs is pulling you in a different direction, you need to actually engage in acts of charity. You need to engage in acts of compassion, and thereby, you know, gain that experiential knowledge of Allah. And only then do you have a hope of, you know, at least beginning to have, you know, a more fulfilled, a more complete knowledge of Allah. This is what we're created for. I think Bediuzzaman would argue we're created to do this. We're not just created to, you know, know Allah in that intellectual sense. If that was the case, maybe we could content ourselves with the arguments of the scholastic theologians. We could know what Allah isn't. We could make an intellectual argument for his existence, but we wouldn't truly know him. I certainly agree of the very important role that experience plays in Bediuzzaman's
But I got the feeling that saying I written down my own observation according to my own understanding, he is also encouraging us to make our own observations as he did for himself, and also it's just encouraged us, you see, to be to engage in the question for meaning in universe and in life.
Yes, that's true, and it's to that extent, I think. I mean, it's for that reason that we don't just see arguments propounded in terms of their premises and their conclusion in that dry logical or philosophical way. What we see is like temsirs, like we see analogies in Âyet'ül Kübra, for example. What are we asked to do? We're asked to imagine a traveler who goes on this journey of tafakkur throughout the whole universe. Yes. What's the point of that? Why did he need to couch the argument in those terms? What need does he have of that representation? What role does it play in the argument that he's making? Well, I think it's exactly as you say, in harnessing the imagination there, in thinking about a traveler actually touring the universe, taking a journey of tafakkur. What he's encouraging us to do is to ourselves take that journey, not merely to imagine someone else taking it. Look, if that traveler can take it, then there's no reason why I can't take it, is probably what he's saying implicitly, right? If the traveler's taking it, then you too can take it, and you too should take it. Again, I agree wholeheartedly with what you say.
There is one more question in the chat box, and there is another comment if you are interested to read also. And this is the final one. I know we are over our time, sure. But this is very short. Nevzat Hoca is asking, he's wondering about the objection that is raised against Ustaz Bediuzzaman, his method, which is quite rational, he is saying, and he's using reasoning to explain the Quran. But the traditionalists are objecting this. That could not be the best way of explanation. What would you say about that?
I just misheard. I didn't hear one of your words. So he's using reasoning to do what, sorry?
Yeah, using reasoning to explain the Quran. And the traditionalists, they object this. This is not the best explanation.
I mean, I guess what Bediuzzaman would worry about, is that, look, we find ourselves, sent here into this universe, okay, with a whole range of faculties. Look, we know that we've not been created other than to worship Allah. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Okay, we've got no business here other than to worship Allah. Which entails, which involves coming to know Him, and and then express that knowledge, through worship. Why would a being of absolute wisdom, absolute hikmah, give us a whole range of faculties if they're not to be used for the purpose for which we're created? So if we find ourselves with, abilities of rationation, abilities of, reasoning, argumentation, and so on, then the primary point of these has got to be for that purpose. Okay, if we've been created to worship, if we've been created to come to know Allah, and the Quran is one of the primary things that makes Allah known, as Bediuzzaman informs us. Well, to fail to use your reason to explicate the Quran, to understand it, to justify its premises, and so on, to fail to do that would seem to run counter to Allah's hikmah, because you'd be failing to use one of your key faculties for the very purpose for which you're created. Similar comments could be made, for example, about the wijdan. There'll be scholars who say that, no, we can only know what's right and wrong through revelation. That the wijdan, that we cannot know without revelation, anything about what's right or wrong. But again, then what point? What is the point in the wijdan in that case? If the wijdan, which seems to be that faculty which recognizes that which is beautiful versus that which is ugly, that which is good versus that which is evil, it seems to function in that way. To fail to use it, to come to know Allah, again, would seem to run counter to Allah's wisdom. So yeah, I would say that Bediuzzaman's on the right track compared to those scholars.
Yeah, thank you very much, for giving us your time, because tomorrow I know early morning you have another class to participate. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much again. And
Allah razı olsun. Allah razı olsun. Thank you so much. Again, I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to, really I should be listening to you guys, so I'm very humbled by the fact that I'd be given an opportunity to address such an esteemed audience.
If you have, you can manage your classes next time, then we'll be glad to listen to you.
Sorry
I
to
heard
interrupt.
Dr. Mahshid to say something.
Yeah, just a quick thing.
Of course, go ahead, sister, please, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Just a very quick one, because I know you want to go. I do think Nursi makes rational arguments, not in the sense of empirical evidence anyway, but more in the sense of undisputable truth, in the sense that he provides evidence through analogy and so on, as you've explained, in such a way that it makes it impossible for the fetra not to recognize those truths. So there are more indications rather than logical explanations. Logical explanations require empirical evidence. So obviously, it answers one of the comments made there. But they are, and in link with Brother Nejati's explanation, linked to Anna, is the fetra. The evidences are such that the fetra, it becomes almost impossible for a fetra not to confirm those explanations. I think Nursi's approach is more that way rather than proofs, logical proofs, or empirical evidence as such. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree, and I believe that's exactly the point that Mustafa Hoja was making a few weeks ago. Certainly the Anna plays that key role, that confirmatory role, right? So of course, in the first instance, sure, it looks like there's a rational argument being propounded there, but that's never to say that the matter's in any way in doubt. What happens is that still the premises of that argument required to be justified, and I think it's at that justificatory stage that the inner plays that confirmatory role. Yeah, so I definitely agree.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll see you, inshallah, 2 weeks from now on with another seminar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you again. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum.
Aleyküm selam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Necati Hocam, biz biraz konuşabilir miyiz bu the teacher training program that is starting on Monday?
Evet Turhan, sana iyi geceler.
Size de iyi geceler. Allah razı olsun.
Teşekkür ederiz.
Görüşürüz.
Hayırlı yolculuklar Avustralya'ya.
Teşekkürler. Sağ ol.